Hi, I'm James Gardner, host of Your History, Your Story, a podcast for anyone who loves hearing fascinating tales about remarkable people, intriguing topics, and significant historical events. Our hope is to inspire you to uncover and share your history and your story. Welcome to Your History, Your Story. In this episode, we're honored to have as our guest Pulitzer Prize-winning historian James M. McPherson. Renowned for his acclaimed work, Battle of Freedom, the Civil War Era, which earned him the Pulitzer Prize, McPherson has also authored many other significant historical books, including the New York Times bestseller, Crossroads of Freedom, Antietam, the battle that changed the course of the Civil War. Today, McPherson will share his insights on the Battle of Antietam, fought on September 17, 1862, America's bloodiest single day, including its military significance, its role in discouraging international support for the Confederacy, and its connection to the Emancipation Proclamation. Additionally, McPherson will discuss the importance of preserving historical battlefields for the benefit of future generations. I'd now like to welcome Jim McPherson to our show. Welcome, Jim.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Well, this is incredible for me because as somebody who's been interested in the Civil War for, most of my life, to be speaking with such a distinguished Civil War historian and author, it's just terrific. So I'm really happy to have you on the show.
Well, I'm looking forward to speaking with you.
So I wanted to say, first of all, when I purchased your book for this interview a while back, a couple months ago, I looked at the cover of the book and it brought back a memory for me. Now, in my earlier years, my wife and I had two young kids at the time. I was working two jobs, but I loved the Civil War. I used to go to Barnes & Noble or whatever bookstore. I used to pick up books on the Civil War. And if it was my birthday, people would buy me books about the Civil War. And I had piles of them in my house, but I had no time to read any of them. So what happened? Unfortunately, I ended up in the hospital for 4 days. I was in my early 30s, and I was sort of just lying there. I had to stay in bed for 4 days, basically. And Kelly brought me a book to read, and it was Battle of Freedom. It was your book.
It might take you more than 4 days to finish that.
Oh, it took me way more than 4, but it got me started, Jim. It's the book that you won the Pulitzer Prize for back in 1989. And I remembered the book cover when I bought this recently. And I don't know what happened to the copy I had. I think I loaned it to somebody and didn't get it back. But I remembered how much I really enjoyed that book. And having at least a few days to get started on it, and I continued with it until I finished it. But it's just a magnificent work. And you've written so many other books on the Civil War, and you've taught history, and you're just a real expert. So thank you again. And before we start talking about another book of yours, which I have in front of me here, it's Crossroads of Freedom, Antietam. And it's about the battle that is known as the bloodiest single day in U.S. history, correct?
That's right.
Yes, and I have it right in front of me, and I've read that one as well. And before we talk about that book, by the way, that was a New York Times bestseller, and it's an excellent read. I highly recommend it. But before we talk about your books, I'm going to talk about you. And when did you start to develop an interest in history and specifically the Civil War?
I first developed an interest in history when I was in college. I grew up in Minnesota, small town. I went to a liberal arts small college in Minnesota, and I took an introductory course in my freshman year in the history of Western civilization. At that time, I didn't know what I was going to major in. I didn't have any clear idea of what I wanted to do in the future, but I was really turned on by that course and by the challenges of trying to understand early modern European histories, which is what that course was about. And in some ways, I had kind of wasted my high school years. I was interested in sports. I was in the band. I was in the chorus. I played three different sports in high school, but I didn't really challenge my mind. This course, as a freshman at Gustavus Adolphus College in Minnesota, my mind was challenged, and I found out that trying to understand what initially was completely obscure to me was really a kind of pleasurable exercise. Up until that time, I had done a lot of exercising of my body, but not of my mind. And that turned me on to history. By the time I was a sophomore, I had decided to focus in American history, but not yet the Civil War, because it was a small college and a small history department and didn't have a particular course on the Civil War. The professor who taught it focused mainly on 20th century history, and so I took everything that I could do in that area. It wasn't really until I got to graduate school. I went to Johns Hopkins University. At that time, I thought I might focus on Southern history in kind of some general vague way, because these were the years of the early part of the civil rights movement, resistance by the South, massive resistance to the Brown decision in 1954, violence between pro-civil rights and anti-civil rights people. And the South was a mystery to me. And I decided I needed to find out more about the history of the South so that I could understand the biggest issue in the United States at that time in the 1950s and 60s. And in the course of studying Southern history, I got very much interested not only in the slavery issue, but in the anti-slavery movement. So I wound up doing my doctoral dissertation on the abolitionists during and after the Civil War. What did they see as the aftermath of the abolition of slavery? And I discovered through reading abolitionist newspapers, letters, speeches, diaries, and so on, that they anticipated in many respects the modern goals of the civil rights movement. And so my doctoral dissertation, which became my first book, really saw the Civil War as a precursor of the world I lived in the 1960s. And from focusing on that particular reform group and the issues that they dealt with, issues of slavery and race, I discovered, as Mao Zedong put it, that the freedom for the slaves came out of the barrel of a gun. And I got more interested in the military and political aspects of the Civil War, because that formed the context of what I had done my principal graduate work on. So I broadened out from this particular reform group to Abraham Lincoln and the political leadership of the Union during the Civil War. And from that, the context of the actual war itself, the military developments. And Battle Cry of Freedom tries to focus on all of these issues and bring them together and show how they're related to each other for the decade of for the 4 years of the war, particularly, and the causes of the war.
And you have to really study all the different aspects to get the full idea of what that war was about, why it happened, and what happened afterward, right? Don't you?
Yes, absolutely. You can't look at any of these questions in isolation from all the others as well. And that's what I tried to do in the book, is to show how they all fit together.
Well, I've been doing some interviews while we've had this podcast and on abolitionists, talking about studying some of the abolitionists. And I noticed that there were different types of abolitionists, how they approached their ideology, what they did. Was it more of like a John Brown or a William Lloyd Garrison approach? But one size didn't fit all, did it?
That's right. There were those abolitionists who focused on what they called moral suasion, trying to convert American society to a belief in the abolition of slavery and the elevation of the freed slaves to some sort of equality of rights in American society. They sort of avoided the politics of the question. They saw it as a moral issue more than as a political or economic issue. But then there were another group of abolitionists that wanted to work through the political structure. And they eventually evolved into the Republican Party, which saw the exclusion of slavery from the new territories as the first step toward, as Lincoln put it, the ultimate extinction of slavery. And that provoked the South to secession when Lincoln was elected in 1860. And that transferred the whole conflict from the moral issue and the political issue to the military outcome of a war.
And ultimately, it was resolved by the gun.
That's absolutely right.
Yes.
The abolition of slavery did come out of the barrel of a gun. Mao Zedong said that communism and so on would come out of the barrel of a gun during the Chinese Civil War. Well, the same thing was true about the freedom for the slaves. That came out of the barrel of a gun.
Yes, absolutely. Now, that brings me to my next point here. Being interested in the Civil War, the battlefield that I've been to visit probably 2 or 3 times is Gettysburg. And Gettysburg it's a lot of fun. It's very educational. I haven't been there in a while, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. And as somebody who loves history and particularly the Civil War, I'm ashamed to say that I have never visited the Antietam battlefield. And in more recent years, I've been learning more about that battle and how truly significant it was. And that's why I was so happy that you wrote a book about that specific battle. It is known as the bloodiest day in U.S. history. So we're talking about the barrel of the gun. When we get to just the time period right before September 17th, 1862, I think was the date of the battle, what was the landscape of the war? Where were we at that point in the Civil War?
Well, the Civil War, of course, started in April of 1861 with the firing on Fort Sumter. And during the first year or so of the war, there had not been any really large-scale battles on the scale of Antietam and many of the other battles that happened from 1862 on. Most of the activities had taken place in the border states, Kentucky, what became West Virginia, Missouri. The Union had managed to gain control over those border states so that they did not secede and join their sister slave states. But the largest single battle in 1861, Bull Run, or as the Confederates called it, Manassas, had been won by the Confederates. At the same time, the Union Navy managed to make several lodgments along the South Atlantic coast and the Gulf Coast in preparation for what would amount to even greater victories in subsequent years. But in the first year of the war, there was no significant advantage to either side. But in the early months of 1862, the Union forces gained a string of significant victories. They gained control of both the Tennessee and Cumberland River and most of the Mississippi River in a group of battles that combined both the Union River Navy and Western armies, Fort Donelson, Fort Henry, Shiloh, the Battle of Memphis, which was a naval victory, the capture of New Orleans and the entire Mississippi Valley, so that by the early summer of 1862, the South, the Confederacy, looked like it was on its last legs. And people in the South and in the North expected that maybe this war was going to be over, this Confederacy would be crushed, forced to return to the Union, but forced to return to the Union with slavery, because had not yet been any significant efforts to bring an end to slavery, which of course was the cause of the war in the first place. But then starting in May and June of 1862, Southern counteroffensives, first in the Shenandoah Valley under Stonewall Jackson, and then in the area right around Richmond in the 7 Days battles under Robert E. Lee for the Confederates succeeded in turning the course of the war in their favor. So that by August 1862, after winning a string of battles just east of Richmond, and then right in almost the suburbs of Washington at the Second Battle of Bull Run or Manassas at the end of August 1862, now it was the Confederacy that was on a roll, and the Union forces were on the ropes. General Robert E. Lee decided to take advantage of that momentum and invade Maryland, and he intended to go on to Pennsylvania if he could in September of 1862. And there was a huge amount of the war at stake in this campaign. Morale was on the side of the Confederacy now. Congressional elections were scheduled for that fall in the North. And the anti-war faction of the Democratic Party looked forward to the possibility of gaining control of the House of Representatives for their party in those congressional elections, which would have seriously handicapped the ability of the Lincoln administration to carry on the war, because it was basically a substantial portion of the Democratic Party was an anti-war party. So there was the political issues of the ability to carry on the war was at stake in this campaign, because Robert E. Lee specifically said that one of his purposes was to continue to undermine Northern morale to the extent that they would cast their votes for an anti-war party. So that was one of the issues at stake in this war. The elections were coming up in October and November of 1862. Equally important, maybe even more important, was the diplomatic situation. Because of the war, the international trade in cotton had been almost shut down. Before the Civil War, the United States provided nearly 3/4 of the cotton in the entire world trade in that commodity, which had the same importance to international trade in the 19th century as oil does today. Therefore, both the British and the French economy, which depended less on the textile industry than the British did, but they still had a significant textile industry, were very much interested in bringing an end to this war. Because their economies were suffering seriously from the American war. So they were in a position and in an intention, really, to intervene in the American Civil War, not necessarily by fighting on the side of the South, but by bringing their diplomatic and, in the case of Britain, naval power to bear to force the North to negotiate a peace with the Confederacy. And that, of course, that peace would have been on the basis of Confederate independence. So that was also at stake in this invasion, because both the British and French had substantially agreed with each other that if Lee succeeded in this invasion, in winning yet another battle coming after the 7 Days and Second Manassas, that the iron would be hot for bringing about an end of the war on the basis of Confederate independence. And if the Lincoln administration refused to accept the British and French offer of mediation, the British and French would recognize the independence of the Confederacy, which would have been a huge morale booster for the Confederacy and given them all kinds of advantages in terms of status as a nation now and not as a belligerent in a civil war. Then there was a third issue at stake in this campaign. By the summer of 1862, Lincoln and his party had pretty much made up their mind that they must strike against slavery. And Lincoln had actually prepared the draft of an Emancipation Proclamation under which he would use his war powers as commander-in-chief of an army at war with the Confederacy to seize enemy property being used to support that war effort. Now, slavery was, of course, the basis of the Confederate economy, and slave labor was a major factor in the logistics of the Confederate Army. So Lincoln told his cabinet in July 1862 that he had made up his mind to issue a proclamation of freedom. He was persuaded by Secretary of State William H. Seward to hold off on that until Union arms won a victory, even if it was an equivocal victory, that it would preclude the possibility that this would be seen as an act of desperation, of our last shriek on the retreat, as Seward put it. So Lincoln decided to hold off the proclamation. And when Lee invaded Maryland and brought on the Battle of Antietam, which resulted in a victory, although it was an equivocal victory, it nevertheless was a Northern victory, Lincoln used that as the occasion that he had been waiting for to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. So three huge issues: foreign policy, the congressional elections, and therefore political ability of the North to continue to carry on the war, and the issue of the abolition of slavery. All three of these were at stake in that campaign. And the outcome of the campaign reversed the Confederate momentum that had been built up over the summer of 1862 and gave Lincoln the chance to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, and also compelled the British to hold back on their recognition of the Confederacy. And the Confederacy the French wanted to go ahead, but they would not go ahead without the British support. And the Confederacy never did achieve recognition by any foreign power during the course of the war, and that made a huge difference in the course of the war as well.
Yes, for sure. Now, just a couple questions. I know Britain had abolished slavery long before the Civil War in America took place. So it seems counter to their, moral convictions to be supporting the South when, the South had slavery. But is it because the economic pressure was a little bit higher ranking for the British?
That would be one way to put it. The British society was divided. British liberals were anti-slavery. They favored the Union side in the Civil War, but of course, the Union before the Emancipation Proclamation was not yet fighting for freedom. So that made it rather ambiguous for the anti-slavery portion of British society to support the North as opposed to the South. So the issue of the Emancipation Proclamation was a huge factor in the British decision once it was finally issued on January 1st, 1863. What Lincoln did immediately after Antietam was issue a preliminary proclamation saying that if the Confederacy was still in existence and fighting by January 1st, 1863, he would issue that final proclamation. So the first preliminary proclamation came on September 22nd, 5 days after Antietam. The final one came on January 1st, 1863, and that drove the final nail into the coffin of any chance of British recognition of the Confederacy. But up until that time, for many people in Britain, the economic crisis created by the virtual cutoff of cotton from the American South kind of outweighed the anti-slavery convictions of a significant portion of the British economy. And not all Britons were anti-slavery. Some people in Britain were identified with Southern society because Southerners seemed to be more like the British gentry and the British nobility than the Northern people did. There was a strong streak of anti-Americanism, which was basically anti-Yankeeism. Yankees being, of course, New England in the North. So British society, apart from the slavery issue, was kind of divided between an anti-Americanism from the upper class of British society to a pro-Americanism, even independent of the slavery issue, on the part of the working class and much of the middle class in British society. So British society was actually quite divided on that issue. But once the Northern commitment to abolishing slavery as an outcome of Northern victory in this war was unequivocal, which really became the fact in January 1863, that meant that the anti-slavery convictions of British society outweighed the economic crisis created by the absence of cotton. Also, as the war went on and as the British developed sources of cotton in India and Egypt that partly replaced by 1863 and 1864 the missing cotton from the South, they became less dependent on cotton from the United States, from the Confederate States.
Thank you for that answer. That is a very good answer. How was Charles Francis Adams as the American ambassador to Great Britain? How effective or how critical was his role in negotiating with the British during this time?
I think it was crucial. Even though Charles Francis Adams was a Yankee, he was from Massachusetts, he got along very well with Lord John Russell, who was the British foreign minister, and Viscount Palmerston, who was the prime minister. He did not share, in their view, he did not share the typical Yankee materialism, American chauvinism that the British identified, braggadocio that they identified with Americans at the time. So his temperament, his personality, and his skills as a diplomat made him a very effective ambassador. And without that skill, I think the American cause in Britain would have been in even worse shape than it was when the Confederacy appeared to be winning the war in the summer and early fall of 1862.
Yeah, it seems like that family legacy of diplomacy from his father, John Quincy Adams, really was
Yes.
passed down, right? Wow. We've really determined this battle was huge in so many ways, in so many areas as far as the outcome of the war. But let's talk about the military. And if you could start by telling us, where was the Battle of Antietam fought?
It was fought just a few miles north of the Potomac River in Maryland, in western Maryland. When the Confederates invaded Maryland in early September 1862, just a few days, starting the invasion just a few days after their victory in the Second Manassas or Second Bull Run, most of that part of Maryland, or one of their purposes in this invasion, as I said before, the two big purposes were the impact on the forthcoming northern elections and the impact on foreign policy. But another hope was that by invading Maryland, they would bring over Maryland to support the Confederacy, that they'd be able to recruit a lot of troops in Maryland, which after all was a slave state. Even though it was a slave state, it did not seceded in 1862. But many Southerners were convinced that the only reason it hadn't seceded is because it was under the thumb of Union military occupation. And if they could invade Maryland and win another military victory, they would gain control of Maryland. And there was a simultaneous invasion of Kentucky, where the same situation prevailed. Kentucky was a Union slave state too. So part of the military purpose of these dual invasions was to gain control of these border slave states, which the Southerners assumed were just panting to join their Southern brothers. because they shared this slave society. Well, it turned out that the part of Maryland that they invaded, Western Maryland, just across the Potomac River, a sliver of Maryland that fell between Virginia and Pennsylvania, was mostly an area of small farms and few slaves. So that area was quite sympathetic to the Union cause. One of the first disappointments of the Confederates in that invasion, even before the Battle of Antietam, or as the Confederates call it, the Battle of Sharpsburg. They named the battle after the village that was near the battlefield, which was typical, by the way, of the naming of many of the battles, not just Antietam versus Sharpsburg, but Manassas versus Bull Run, and a couple of other battles in the Western Theater, too. In any case, this was a part of Maryland of small farms and relatively few slaves.
So that didn't go too well for the Confederates in that respect. But let's talk about the armies and start really with the leaders. For the Union, you had General George McClellan. Anything I've ever read about George McClellan was that he was always hesitating to fight because he thought he was outmatched, that he didn't have enough supplies or his army wasn't ready yet. And the other combatant was General Robert E. Lee, leading the Confederate Army. Can you talk briefly about each one of those leaders and what they felt they were facing in this battle?
Well, you're absolutely right about McClellan's shortcomings as a general. He always thought he was outnumbered by the enemy, and sometimes he would inflate the number of Confederate soldiers that he was facing. This had been true in the 7 Days battles of June and early July 1862, and it was true in the Confederate invasion of Maryland as well. He was cautious. He avoided risk. I think it was in McClellan's case, to a significant degree, a psychological problem. He had been born with kind of a silver spoon in his mouth. He had graduated number 2 in his West Point class. He had been successful in the pre-war army, and then when he had resigned, he had been the president of 2 different railroads in the Midwest. He had succeeded in everything he had tried in life. And I think that created he was constantly insecure about success, even though he always triumphed. He was afraid to take risks. And that's a fatal fault in a military commander, because the very nature of military command in time of war is risk-taking. And so in order to avoid taking a risk, you overestimate the power of the enemy that you face, because he always is going to be stronger than you. And if you attack him, you risk losing. And McClellan was afraid of losing because he had never experienced losing before. He had always succeeded in everything, but underneath that veneer of success was a fear of failure. Robert E. Lee, in many ways, was just the opposite. He was the war's preeminent risk taker. On several occasions, he would defy the rule that you never divide your force in the face of the enemy. And even though inferior in numbers, and he always estimated the enemy numbers pretty accurately, and he always had fewer troops than the enemy. McClellan always thought he had fewer troops than the enemy, but he always had more. And in the case of the Antietam campaign, he had twice as many. But he estimated that Lee had more than he did. But Lee was willing to take risks. And of course, in the preliminaries to the Antietam campaign, he did divide his army. He actually divided it into 4 parts after he crossed the Potomac River, because there was a Union garrison at Harper's Ferry on the Potomac River of 13,000 men that would have been in his rear, threatening his communications to the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia if he had not attacked it. So his first step once he got into Maryland was to divide his army and send Jackson with more than half of it to capture Harper's Ferry and the 12,000 soldiers, Union soldiers there, which they managed to do. In any case, McClellan in this campaign probably had about 80,000 soldiers, of whom 75,000 or so were effectives. Some of them were on the sick list, some of them were on detached duty or logistical duty. Lee started out that invasion with about 50,000 men. However, the Confederates had been marching and fighting for 2 months straight. Their logistical capacity was weak. A lot of the soldiers were barefoot. They were hungry. The supply wagons couldn't keep up with the army. And as a consequence, as the Confederates moved north and crossed the Potomac River, there were huge numbers of stragglers who couldn't keep up with the army. So by the time that the Confederate army got to Sharpsburg after capturing Harper's Ferry, where they suffered relatively few casualties, there were probably at least 10,000 stragglers left behind barefoot on the macadamized roads of Maryland, exhausted, hungry. And so Lee was probably unable to bring to the Antietam battlefield more than 40,000 men. He claimed his numbers were about 37,000, but let's say 40,000, whereas McClellan had close to 80,000. McClellan thought that Lee had 110,000.
Can I ask you this question? Did they have any kind of intelligence or scouting in place during the Civil War where they could have some idea how many troops the other side was putting on the battlefield? I mean, it sounds like there weren't any,
Well,
but
they both did have cavalry scouts. The cavalry scouts' main duty was to find out where the enemy army was, and secondarily to make some kind of estimate of the number of men in the enemy army. But that was always a kind of a hit and miss, the estimate of the number of men. McClellan had an intelligence service under Allen Pinkerton, was the famous head of the Pinkerton Detective Bureau in Chicago. But Pinkerton also overestimated the number of enemy soldiers, partly because he knew that's what McClellan wanted to hear. He was reluctant, even if he knew that his estimates of enemy troops was wrong, he was reluctant to tell McClellan what McClellan didn't want to hear. So he basically reinforced McClellan's weakness of overestimating the enemy numbers. He served McClellan very poorly in that respect. Lee had Jeb Stuart as his chief of cavalry, and Stuart was an excellent cavalry leader and excellent in scouting enemy positions, and was not bad either in actually estimating the enemy's strength. He sometimes overestimated it, but never on the same scale as the Union forces did. At this stage of the war, Union cavalry was much inferior to Confederate cavalry. Later on, that situation was reversed. But in 1862, one of the advantages that the Confederates had was a better cavalry, a smarter cavalry, and a more effective cavalry.
You know, when I think about McClellan, you wonder what was his goal here? I mean, how much bigger could he get his army? How much more well supplied could he have his army? How much more did he want to train his army before he was ready to go? I think about a sports analogy. When you have maybe a team has a really good defense, they've got great uniforms, everybody looks terrific. But if you don't at some point put some points on the board, you're going to lose, right?
You're spot on about McClellan. That analogy is a good one. Part of his hesitancy to act was that his army was never ready because some of the horses lacked horseshoes, Some of the men lacked maybe bayonets for their rifles, whatever it might be. The Army was never 100% fully equipped, and therefore he wasn't yet ready to act. Well, again, you're never going to have everything perfect. But McClellan was hesitant to move until every horseshoe nail was in place. But your analogy to a sports team, not you got to put up the points, even if some of your guys aren't really at the top of their form that day.
You're right. Now I'm just thinking another thing. Where was McClellan's heart on the slavery issue?
Well, personally, he disliked slavery, but he did not believe that it should be an issue in the war. He opposed the abolitionists. He opposed making slavery an issue in the war. He opposed moving toward emancipation because he thought that that would just make the South fight harder. He said that this should not be a war between peoples. It should not be a war between social systems. It should be a war between armies. And the purpose of this war should be to restore the Union and not to destroy the infrastructure, including slavery, of the South. Because that would just alienate the South from the Northern people forever.
Got it.
In other words, the way he saw what he thought winning the war meant was winning a couple of battles over Confederate armies in order to persuade the Southern people to come back into the Union. But by this stage of the war was now a year and a half old during the Antietam campaign, it was clear that the Southern people were not going to come back into the war unless they were thoroughly beaten, unless there's a society, their ability, their physical ability, their economic ability, their military ability to wage war was completely crushed out. But McClellan didn't believe in crushing the South. He did not believe in destroying its social system, which of course was based on slavery. In the eyes of many people in the North, especially Republicans who were becoming increasingly anti-slavery, they were anti-slavery to start with, but the war was making them more anti-slavery because, after all, slavery was the basis of the society that they were fighting. They saw McClellan's lack of conviction about destroying the ability of the South to carry on war, it's destroying the infrastructure of the South as a form of treason. And they were becoming very suspicious of McClellan's loyalty. I think that suspicion was unjustified. It was not that McClellan was opposed. It was not that he favored the Confederacy, but he did not favor destroying the South.
Now, if we could talk about the battle itself. So that September 17th, 1862 in Sharpsburg, why was it that it was such a bloody battle? What was it about the strategy or how it was approached that made it so horrific?
You know, I've asked myself that question many times, and I don't have a good answer for that. Clearly, in the experience of the soldiers who fought it, it was the most intense 12 hours, the most violent 12 hours of the entire war. And that's really saying something when you compare it to a battle like Gettysburg or Shiloh or the Wilderness or Chancellorsville, and many others that were very violent. But there was something about Antietam. And one answer to that is that both sides were aware of the stakes in this battle that I talked about earlier. The stakes for the Confederacy: if they won the battle, they win the war, maybe. Or they'll get British support. They'll help the anti-war Democrats win the elections. They'll force Lincoln to negotiate a peace. The Union soldiers were aware of these stakes as well, and that made them fight harder. Another possibility, this is, these are just possibilities, is that the soldiers whose hearts were weak, we'll put it that way, weren't there. Remember, I talked about the 10,000 stragglers for the Confederacy. McClellan suffered a lot of straggling too, not to that degree, but a lot. So the guys who actually made it to Sharpsburg were the ones who were not afraid to fight. They believed in what they were doing. They knew what the stakes were. The guys who were likely, as they said in the Korean War, to bug out when the going got tough, had already bugged out in the form of straggling. So it was really the hardcore guys who were aware of what was at stake who were fighting on that September 17th. That may be part of the answer to the question, too.
Yeah, I've seen photographs. I actually saw that photographers came to the battlefield not long after the last shot was fired, and some of the particularly horrendous areas was a place called Bloody Lane.
Yes.
And the Confederate line was just identified by all the corpses, and of
You
course,
could walk 200 or 300 yards without stepping on the ground because of the dead bodies in Bloody Lane. Yeah, those were horrendous photographs. And by the way, those photographs were seen a month after the battle at Matthew Brady's studio in New York City. He put on a show called the Dead of Antietam because it was Brady's staff that had gone to Antietam 2 days after the battle and took those photographs. Yeah, they are horrendous. And they had a significant impact on the home front. When it was the first time that photographs of dead bodies after a battle had ever been seen.
Yeah, in the summertime, and it was just absolutely awful. In your book, I know it talks about some of the eyewitnesses who saw the aftermath, and you take for granted what must have been involved in the cleanup there and what it meant to the local people. And when those armies left, I guess the Confederates had to leave they had to leave the dead there as well as some of the wounded. So let's talk about the outcome of the battle. I understand it was a very slight edge would have been given to the Union. Is that right?
Well, it was the Confederates who ultimately retreated. If you decide who wins a battle on the basis of which army retreats after the battle is over, it was the Union that won the battle. On the other hand, Union casualties were a little bit greater than the Confederates. The Confederates did stand their ground for a day after the battle before they did retreat on the 19th. McClellan, in many ways, tactically, it was a drawn battle. Neither side really fought the other or forced the other side to retreat pell-mell. Didn't drive them across the Potomac River. When the Confederates retreated back across the Potomac River, it was the result of a deliberate decision after a day and a half of standing their ground following the battle. But it was a strategic victory from the North in all the ways that I just mentioned in terms of the political and foreign policy and slavery issues that it decided. So in that respect, Antietam was not as great a victory as some others on either side in the war, but it was nevertheless still a Union victory strategically.
Did McClellan get puffed up from this, thinking he was right, he won, he's the victor, he needs to be, in charge at that point?
He was puffed up. He thought he had won. He had fought a brilliant battle, but Lincoln did not agree with him, and many of the people in the North did not agree with him, because Lincoln's hope that with the kind of logistical supply superiority and numerical superiority that McClellan had in this battle, although McClellan did not agree about that, of course, that he should have smashed the Confederate army rather than allowing them to retreat on September 19th without further damage.
Oh, I see.
In other words, although McClellan won, he did not win big as many people had hoped he would.
Mm.
and that I personally think he could have if he. I mean, 20,000 of those 80,000 Union soldiers at Antietam did not fire a shot in anger during the battle. McClellan kept them in reserve and never used them.
Oh, see that's what I was going to ask. I thought it was, I think the numbers were like 80 to 50 or something like that. I thought, why
Also
wasn't it
80 to 40 or 75 to 40.
75 to 40? So I would have thought that, hey, that would have been a big advantage to the Union. So he had a lot of those soldiers in reserve. Okay.
Yeah. And the reason he did not use them is that he assumed the Confederates had even more soldiers in
Of
reserve
course he did.
because he was assuming that they had 110,000 men. So he saved his reserves because he was afraid the Confederates were going to use their reserves and he would need his own to counter the Confederates' reserves. That was typical of McClellan's psychology.
Wow. So Jim, what were the total casualties for that day?
It was about 12,500 Union and 10,700 Confederates. Basically 12 and 11, the 12 plus and 11 minus a few. So 23,000 on both sides. And of those 23,000, very few were captured and therefore were not counted among the missing. More than 22,000 of them were either killed or wounded. And the best estimates are that somewhere between around 4,000 died immediately on September 17th during the battle itself. Another 2,000 and maybe as many as 2,500 of those who were wounded ultimately died days and sometimes weeks later of the wounds. So the ultimate outcome was probably between 6,000 and 6,500 killed and mortally wounded, and just under 17,000, between 16 and 17,000 wounded who survived. Although many of them, of course, lost their legs or their arms and could never fight again.
That is horrendous. You know, I have to ask this question, and I know that McClellan he ended up being replaced. How long did he last in his position after Antietam?
He lasted less than 2 months. After the battle, both armies, of course, were badly hurt. Confederates retreated and moved south in the Shenandoah Valley. The Confederates did. McClellan stayed, and the Union Army stayed in the Sharpsburg area for nearly 2 months, or, well, 6 weeks, from September 17th until October 25th. So that's a little 5.5 weeks. During that time, he kept badgering Washington, saying, "I need, shoes for the army. Many of the horses are crippled, and I don't have my cavalry is weak. The wounded need time to recover." All kinds of claims that he needed all these things again. Remember what I said? The army's never ready to move until every last horseshoe is on. And Lincoln kept urging him, "Get after the enemy, move while this good fall weather before winter comes, and shuts fighting down. Move across the Potomac River." Well, McClellan kept saying, "Oh, I need this, I need that," and he finally started moving in the last week of October. Lincoln was already disgusted with him, and when he did move, it took him 6 days to get the whole army across the river. The Confederates had done that in one night earlier, and then he moved very slowly and cautiously, and Lincoln finally gave up in disgust. And on November 7th, he removed McClellan from command. McClellan lasted a little less than 2 months after the battle.
Yeah, and then of course we know that McClellan went on to run against Lincoln in 1864 for president, which didn't pan out for him. But so at the end of the battle, terrible losses, both armies terribly wounded, and of course the war still went on for another couple of years, more than 2 years afterwards. So Lee lived to fight again and again and again. We saw some of the same errors popping up. For instance, I recall at Gettysburg that Meade did not chase after to finish Lee off after Gettysburg. So there were some of those errors. And then ultimately, I guess Lincoln called in his finishers, Grant and Sherman and Sheridan. Yeah, the top three there. And they did what he wanted McClellan to do, but he never would. So the battle is over. There was enough of a Union edge in that the Confederates retreated so that Lincoln was able to really issue the Emancipation Proclamation, and all the other things that you mentioned before were able to happen. So if you could sum up the Battle of Antietam in just a few words as to how important to U.S. history it is, what would you say?
Well, I argued in my book, Antietam, Crossroads of Freedom, that Antietam was one of the most significant turning points in the war. It blunted Confederate momentum. It made possible the Emancipation Proclamation. It precluded the diplomatic recognition of the Confederacy by foreign nations, which probably would have turned out, if it had happened, to be the first step toward some kind of intervention on behalf of the Confederacy. So it was an important turning point toward ultimate Union victory, which meant a turning point toward the abolition of slavery and the replacement of a society based on two concepts of what sort of country the United States ought to be. Those two concepts were an agrarian hierarchical society based on slavery versus a commercializing, industrializing, middle-class society based on freedom, free labor. So that's not only a turning point in the battle, in the Civil War itself, but a turning point in American history. If that battle had come out differently, it's quite possible that we would not be one united country today. It's quite possible that slavery would have lasted for, decades, maybe a generation or more after the Civil War. It's quite possible that we would not have ever had a black president of the United States, and there wouldn't have been necessarily a United States, but two. A United States and a Confederate state in North America. All of these things were riding in many respects on the outcome of that battle.
That is amazing. I wonder, in school when we learn about the Civil War, and whether in high school or in some college courses, if there's really as much emphasis on the Battle of Antietam as there should be, because there's so much involved in it. As we know through this discussion and talking to you, there were so many things at stake, and it was just a pivotal time in the war and in this nation's history. Now, if somebody would get in the car and drive to Sharpsburg, to the battlefield of Antietam today, what would they see there?
The battlefield of Antietam is one of the best preserved battlefields in the country. It looks today not much different in many respects from what it looked like at the time. The famous landmarks in the battle, the East Woods, the West Woods, the Dunkard Church, they're all still there. The sunken road, which became Bloody Lane, it's still there. The Park Service leases out the agricultural land to local farmers to put in crops similar to the crops that existed in 1862. So that depending on the year you go there, because the farmers will alternate crops between, say, corn and grain of some kind, but depending on what year you go there, the famous 30-acre cornfield where so much of the bloodiest fighting took place is still a cornfield. Although the corn is taller now and much more closely planted together, so you can't walk through the cornfield the way the soldiers did when they were fighting through it, because now farmers use pesticides rather than cultivating the corn. But it has a high degree of what people in historic preservation call integrity. That is, it has not changed very much over the past 170 years.
That is so cool. I am my son-in-law's parents live not far from that battlefield. So I want to make it a point to go down there and visit.
It's also one of the easiest battles to understand because it took place in three stages. And those stages are geographically separate from each other. They're adjacent to each other, obviously, but the morning battle in the cornfield, in the West Woods, and in the East Woods that went on from about 6 o'clock in the morning until both aspects of the army that were there were shot to pieces. Then the action shifted to the center of the battlefield, which is basically the Bloody Lane area and the area surrounding it, from about 10:30 or 11 o'clock until the Union breakthrough there at about 1 p.m. And then about 1 p.m., the fighting down Mount Burnside's Bridge until A.P. Hill's people came up about 4 o'clock in the afternoon to stop Burnside's advance toward the village of Sharpsburg. So the battle takes place in three stages, and geographically you can follow that. You can walk, and it's the battlefield is probably a couple thousand acres, but you can walk it in a day. You feel like walking it.
I would love to walk that. That sounds great. Now, that's that battlefield. Obviously, they've done a really good job of preserving that. Are there other battlefields throughout the country, Civil War battlefields, that are in danger of being encroached upon?
Any battlefield near Washington, between Washington and Richmond, is in danger all the time of being encroached on, and that's a lot of battlefields. It's the Manassas battlefield for First and Second Bull Run. It's all the battlefields around Richmond. It's the battlefields around Fredericksburg, which is the Battle of Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, the Wilderness, and Spotsylvania. That area is constantly under threat. And as a consequence, much of the effort of the various battlefield preservation groups are focused on trying to acquire and defend from commercial and urban development, because basically the whole area between Washington and Richmond is part of an East Coast megalopolis that stretches from Boston to Richmond. So those battlefields are under continuous stress. Much more than, say, Antietam or even Gettysburg, and of course, much more than a battlefield like Shiloh or Vicksburg, which are in much more lightly populated areas.
Are there situations where organizations have actually bought back land for battlefield preservation?
Yeah, and that's been going on for a long time. Right now, the American Battlefield Association, American Battlefield Trust, I should say, which is an evolution of what used to be called, started out as the Association for the Preservation of Civil War Battlefield, APCWS. Then that evolved into the Civil War Preservation Trust, which evolved into the Civil War Trust, which then evolved into the American Battlefield Trust, because it still focuses mainly on Civil War battlefield preservation, but also has done preservation work for the Revolution and the War of 1812.
Wow, that's great. Now I know you've been involved to some degree with battlefield preservation. Is there some way people can get involved or find out more information where they may want to contribute to either through their, volunteering or financially?
They should go online and type in American Battlefield Trust.
American Battlefield Trust. Yeah, that is great. I know
there are others as well. There's the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Trust. Then there's one called the Central Virginia Battlefield. I think it's trust, but it may be association. But all of those would also be listed under the American Battlefield Trust as well. And all kinds of information, how you can contribute to that, what they've done and what they are proposing to do in the way of acquiring more land as it comes up for sale. They've been proactive in many cases in identifying possible opportunities for trust. This is especially true in the Shenandoah Valley, where there's no national park or even no state park of battlefield preservation. It's all private land that's been acquired by the Shenandoah Valley Battlefield Trust. They've been very proactive in identifying anybody who might be interested in selling their land, not to a developer, but to a historic preservation association.
Instead of a strip mall, right?
Instead of a strip mall.
Oh, wow. Jim, this has been so much fun. It has been, I mean, we're talking about a terrible, tragic day in history, but it's fun with respect to how interesting a story it really is and how important that day was in American history. And certainly a lot of good things came out of something very terrible and bad. So we're thankful for those things anyway. But so what are you up to these days?
Well, I've continued my interest in history. I retired from teaching nearly 20 years ago, and I'm getting older, so I'm not able to be as active as I was in various things like battlefield preservation or giving Civil War tours. Over the years, I've given dozens and dozens of tours of the battlefields, including Antietam, more to Gettysburg than any other single battlefield, but the next to the Gettysburg has been Antietam. But I've got a bad knee and I can't do as much walking as I used to. So I'm almost 88 years old. So I can't be as active as I was, but I still try to keep up with what's going on in battlefield preservation, contribute money to it, for example, give talks, although I don't do nearly as much of that as I used to either. So I stay as active as I'm physically able to do.
Well, Jim, you look terrific. You make history come alive. You just the way you approach it, the way you tell the story. We're about telling stories on your history, your story, obviously by our name, but you are a wonderful storyteller, and I cannot say enough about your book, Battle Cry of Freedom, and also Antietam, Crossroads of Freedom. Two terrific books. You've got so many more books out there. I know you won the Lincoln Prize for one of them. What was the name of that book?
Well, I won the Lincoln Prize twice, actually.
Oh,
The
okay.
first one was for the title of the book was For Cause and Comrades, Why Men Fought in the Civil War. It was a study of the motivation of Civil War soldiers on both sides, what they thought they were fighting for and why they were fighting, because they were nearly all volunteers. And then I also won a second Lincoln Prize for a book called Tried by War, Abraham Lincoln as Commander-in-Chief. It was a study of, as the title indicates, Lincoln, not just as president, but as Commander-in-Chief, because Lincoln's whole tenure as President of the United States was bounded by war. He was never a president during, well, for a few weeks before the war broke out. The country was at peace, but otherwise, his whole presidency, the country was at war. So it was a study of that.
And he only had six days, I guess, from Appomattox to his death at at the Peterson House, I should say.
Right. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
it was his time to be happy, and it was very short-lived.
That's right. He was happy, but it didn't last long, I'm afraid. No.
Jim, thank you so much. I really appreciate all the work you're doing. I hope you continue to stay active in the preservation business, cause, I should
We
say.
will.
And if you are going to be out at any of those battlefields giving tours to anybody, please let me know. And Kelly and I would love to tag along.
Yeah. Well, my touring days may be over because I have trouble walking now. I had knee replacement surgery and it's giving me trouble again.
Well, I drive a mean golf cart.
Yeah, well, that's a possibility. I'll keep it in mind as a possibility.
Well, regardless, let's please stay in touch because
Great.
just a fun person. You know so much about American history, and I'd love to learn more about some of your other books as well.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me. I enjoyed this conversation very much.
All right, Jim. Listen, have a great day.
Okay. You too. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Your History, Your Story. Don't forget to follow us on YouTube, Facebook, X, and Instagram to stay connected. We'd love to hear from you, whether you have questions, comments, or a story to share. Until next time, be well and God bless.